All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Donnell. I'm the Manager of Support Services here at All-Trans-Tech. I'm happy to have the opportunity to introduce this morning's webcast on keeping your NDT program compliant during the current COVID-19 travel restrictions. This presentation today is going to be done by Jim Donnell and Steve McCullough. I apologize for anyone who was on last week, but for any new listeners, I'm going to reintroduce them. Jim is the Vice President of Technical Services here at All-Trans-Tech. He has worked in the rail industry for over 33 years and has been with All-Trans-Tech for over 21 years. He has AS-NDT Level 3 in 8 different NDT methods and is a Senior AWS CWI. Steve is the Director of Welding and NDT at All-Trans-Tech. He has worked in the rail industry for over 32 years and has been with All-Trans-Tech for over 10 years. He has his AS-NDT Level 3 in 5 different NDT methods and is a Senior AWS CWI. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. All-Trans-Tech is one of North America's largest railcar management consulting companies. We provide fleet management and technical services to a variety of railcar owners, shippers, as well as repair facilities. We're going to structure this presentation with approximately 45 minutes of content, followed by 15 minutes of question and answer. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the question pane, which should be on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar window. We will work through the questions through the Q&A period. I would also like to mention that All-Trans-Tech will be providing upcoming webinars over the next few weeks. We currently have the following scheduled. Next Wednesday, April 29th, we'll be doing a webinar on critical to quality characteristics for quality assurance programs. The registration email will go out shortly after today's webinar. With that being said, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'm happy to introduce Jim Donnell and Steve McCullough.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to one of the All-Trans-Tech's webinars. I'm trying to keep everybody informed with what's going on in the current situations. A little disclaimer, All-Trans-Tech disclaimer here. This presentation is really a discussion on possible solutions or actions a company can temporarily implement during the travel restrictions. Now, how this applies to your individual program is really going to be your decision. And also it's going to depend upon your components that you make, the processes that you do. Again, federal regulations, FRA and Transport Canada, AR regulations, and then your agreement with your NDT Level 3. All those have to play into processes or certain things we can't do if the FRA or the Transport Canada says it can't be done. So with that said, I just want to make sure everybody kind of understands that disclaimer. The Rail Supply, RSI, the Railway Supply Institute is in the process of asking the AAR for either relief or some guidance into how to answer many of these questions. Now, we don't know when we're going to get some of those answers. They may be sooner than later. I know the AAR subcommittee meetings are being put on this week as we speak. In the meantime, while we're waiting for some kind of guidance from the regulators, over the next several slides, we will discuss compliance during the COVID-19 travel restrictions, because there's some things that are going to come due where you may not be able to get it done possibly with travel restrictions. Maybe we'll give you some possible answers or things to think about. First, what I really want to do is let's review the NDT program requirements and flow process. I'll go through this very quickly. I'm sure everybody kind of understands the process, but I want to make sure we're all talking on the same page. The main thing is your company written practice with the NDT program. I always say that's your operating manual. If something breaks down, your fridge or your generator or something, if something breaks down, you're going to go into the manual and see how do I fix it or what are the possible causes. So this is the same thing with your NDT program. This is how you perform and how you regulate your NDT program. When qualifying and certifying personnel, you really establish a company written practice. It's required, and it's the first step you're going to do. And the company written practice is a document that describes how the employer controls and administers the personnel training, examination, certification of NDT personnel. Now, it's going to also describe levels of certification. What can a level 1 do? I know that last week there was a question about, can level 1s do work? Absolutely. If the procedure allows for it and your written practice allows for it, level ones, NDT level ones can definitely do work. But again, it has to be described in both the procedures and the written practice. You know, what level 2 can do, what a level 3 can do. And one thing that's kind of missed is who's the certifying authority? Who has the authority to sign the certification that is required? It's kind of a designated company official. You know, it goes on to describe, you know, personnel duties and responsibilities, training requirements, what are your experience requirements needed, examination requirements, questions on tests, how many questions you need to do, and then records, documentation, including, you know, who controls your NDT documentation, copies of the test, copies of the eye exam. You know, how long do I keep the eye exams? How long do I keep the test? Do I keep it for the lifetime of the employee is employed? Or do I, you know, as soon as we terminate the employee or the employee leaves, are we allowed to discard the documentation? The regulations don't tell you what you do, but it says whatever you do should be in a written practice. You know, what are the basic levels of certification, documentation requirements? And then it also will describe initial training requirements, and then what are the refresher training requirements? You know, these for initial training requirements, the trainee shall have a sufficient educational and experience background before you even start or to put a person in a class. That's going to be described in your written practice. Do they have to have a high school education? What is required for their educational background? And then what is their experience background need to be? The training requirements, the classroom, as far as the classroom training requirements, the minimum hours are listed in the Appendix T, but then again, that's also going to be in your written practice. Those are minimum requirements. You are free to add more questions if you want, if your level 3 wants to, but there's a minimum number required. And whatever you do, if you do training directly to a level 2, which can be, you can go training directly from a trainee to a level 2. When you do that, all you do is sum the hours up between level 1 and level 2. And a really good thing with the written practice is that what happens if certain things happen, like what if an expiration of employee certification, what do I do? Something expired. What if I have to suspend the employee certification? What if you revoke employee certification? Those are all really different things. And then if you do have a suspension or revocation and you want to reinstate the employee certification, employee left, came back, had a bad day, quit, happens all the time. What do you do for reinstating the employee? Those are all things that have to be spelled out. Regulations says don't really tell you what it has to be, but it has to be in your written practice. And then refresher training requirements. You know, and really the refresher training requirements are going to be based on, you know, the relative difficulty in the method, the experience of the NDT personnel. You know, are they somebody that's been doing it for 25, 30 years versus a person that was going through his first refresher training? You know, what's the criticality of inspection? You know, and really what type of a refresher training is. Every method has certain levels of complication or levels of where ones are a little more difficult than others. And generally for certifications for level 1, level 2, they're generally on a 3-year cycle. For the level 3s are on a 5-year cycle. I know that's kind of a problem because in our industry, that is in the rail industry, it's 3 years for level 1, level 2. But then outside subcontractors who go to other certification specifications like SNTC 1A and CP 1A9, they have been stretched out to 5 years for level 1, level 2. And that does cause a problem when you subcontract personnel. So real quick through the certification summary. Initial certification, document, perform eye exam, document, you know, educational background, perform eye exam, do your classroom training, give your 3-part exam, general, specific, and practical, then you log your hours. And second, issue your certification, you know, certification, that's the company name, the individual, the method certified, the issue date, expiration date. If there is a limited cert, you want to put the limitation on the cert. I didn't put that in there. And then it should be signed by the certifying authority. Remember, you can have an auditor come in, FRA or AR auditor, and they see a person signing that cert, and they're going to say, okay, is that person authorized to sign that cert? And that authorization should be some sort of letter from the company. And then recurrency training every 3 years. And also technical performance evaluations. Those are both required. Okay, on the next several slides, I'm going to try to discuss questions about how to stay compliant, with the COVID-19 travel restrictions, where things coming due with your NDT and welding programs. Steve will talk about the welding end of it when I'm done with the NDT side of it. And maybe give you some possible answers. Again, how you decide your answers are going to be strictly based on your program. So say concern, you have refresher training come up. We're having this stuff already. We are level 3 for many companies. We have people who do for refresher training, but usually we would come and do the training, we would travel, and right now many companies are not allowing people into the facilities unless, it's really, really, really essential. So some possible answers would be maybe a temporary allowance in a written practice, or you can get an approval letter from your level 3 for maybe some remote, especially for refresher training, maybe some remote distance learning, like a webinar or something like that, or an extension from the NDT level 3, where you can extend the cert based off of continuing good practice. And many times it's written in a written practice that you can do that. If the person looks like they've been performing their duties correctly and have no issues with any audits or anything that has ever happened, you can say, look, we're going to temporarily continue the certification until at that point travel restrictions are lifted and we're able to get there to do the refresher training. Another question would be the visual acuity exams. Now, those are due annually, and they're due for NDT personnel annually, and I think on welding on a 3-year cycle. So for welders, they're on the 3-year cycles, and for NDT people, they're on an annual cycle. Most companies many companies, I should say, rely on outside examiners and medical professionals for eye exams, depending on the written practice. And currently, there's a lot of medical facilities that are not accepting patients right now unless it's something in dire need. But for something from just like a visual acuity for near vision, it's not really a high priority for them, and they're going to want you to stay away from the clinics. So some possible answers is, have temporary allowance in your written practice, or I would say the best thing would be an approval letter from your level 3 for maybe an additional designated visual acuity examiners. They can be done by yourself, but the person who administers the eye exam, the NDT or welding personnel, has to be designated by a level 3 to give the eye exam. If they have the eye chart, the near vision eye chart, the Jaeger chart, they could do it themselves for their personnel. But that person has to be designated. You should have a procedure how to do it, and that person will follow the procedure, and the designated eye examiner can administer to the other people. And I've had this question come up, but no, you can't give yourself an eye exam. Then you could also maybe ask for a temporary extension from the level 3. It's kind of iffy, but maybe you can say we can temporarily extend, till we can get the person to get an eye exam. But what I would say is that when it does come due, you want to make sure if they do not pass the eye exam, then you would have to figure out how that would possibly cause problems with any kind of quality product that you sent out. Another thing that's required in the written practice and required in your NDT program is you have to do a technical performance evaluation on your NDT employees. And that means an actual hands-on, watching them do the test and evaluating their proficiency. Not refresher training, but this is actual hands-on evaluation, like a hands-on audit that you do for your NDT personnel. Most companies require an independent evaluator for their technical performance evaluators, or a consultant. I know, and we at All Transtech, we do this many times for our customers. So, say you have your people on a technical performance evaluation for every 3 years, it's coming due. Well, what can I do? Well, for temporarily, you can allow in your written practice, for an approval level from the level 3 for maybe some live remote observation, something where you're actually watching that person perform the test. Now, with the technical performance evaluation, you're not going to do any kind of coaching. It's not refresher training. So they have to do the test according to their procedures, and you just evaluate them. And generally, it's going to be like on a 10-point checklist. That's what we use. Saying, are they using the right procedure? Did they do the proper techniques? Did they document the test correctly? You'd be surprised what you find on the technical performance evaluation where somebody's not as strayed from the herd, so to speak. And many times it's a good way to get people to follow your procedure correctly. You could do that with live remote observation, or again, the person's been performing their tests pretty good, and you may want an extension from your level 3 to extend the written practice, till a later date when travel restrictions are lifted. Now, say you have a new employee and you want to have some new training, initial training for new employees. Now, companies may have a situation where they need one or more new employees to go through the initial training. This is a little tricky. Possible answers is temporary allowance from the level 3 you can begin accruing experience hours with level 2 personnel. It's actually not a bad idea sometimes. Say you require 80 hours of experience. You may say, look, I want them to gain 40 hours of experience before they even get into the class so they even understand the method. It really helps if somebody gets into the class if they've actually seen the method being performed, instead of walking in, where they've never even seen a dye penetrant or never even seen a magnetic particle done. So sometimes, but whatever you do, those hours should be stated in your written practice. You may say, look, we can gain 50% of the experience hours even before you get in the class. That's one thing you can get, so that you can, at least you can get your employees, again, they can't do the test, but they're just watching under a level 2, gaining experience hours. And again, you could also do remote distance learning as initial training. Now, the problem is with the remote distance learning is that we still have to, with initial training, we have a 3-part test where we have to give out. So then we're not there to give out the test as our trainers. We may be able to proctor or designate somebody to proctor the exams. It would have to be somebody maybe within the quality department that you trust to proctor the exam, and a proctor cannot help them in any way. They just give the exam, collect it back, send it to us, and we grade it when it gets here. That's one possible way. Now, with the practical exam, that's okay for the general and specific. With the practical exam, that's going to be a little harder. You still may have a proctor do that if they're a level 2 and you think that they are pretty proficient in what they do. They may be able to proctor the practical exam. Again, not ideal, but this is some things that you could possibly do. Then say you did go through initial training. Now you want to gain experience hours for newly classroom trained employees. Now, after initial training, how do you accomplish this hands-on experience hours with a level 2? Okay, some possible answers is if you have a certified level 2, then there is really no issue. You have your initial training done, then you put them out on the floor working with an experienced level 2 to gain their experience hours. That's not a problem. But now, say you did initial training, you have no level 2s on site, there's not much you can do without physical oversight. And I would not be comfortable with doing that with something like a remote training or like GoPro or something like that, you know, because really, when you're doing hands-on experience training, you want to have the level 2 with them to answer the questions as they go, to correct them as it goes. You know, it's very important. Experience hours is very important working on a level 2. So you don't want to compromise that training. So another concern, your procedure qualification records for non-destructive testing procedures. Companies, you may have the need to revise your NDT procedure. Happens all the time. You have to stay current. And if that would change, if you want to change your procedure, NDT procedure, now if you change an essential variable that's spelled out in Appendix T, that triggers a new procedure qualification record. It has to be done. So now this is probably one of the easier ones to answer. Generally, we would go to the facility and use your equipment, and as a level 3 on a procedure qualification record, it has to be performed by a level 2 or level 3 and signed off by a level 3. It has to be witnessed or observed by a level 3. We could do this possibly off-site. I know we at Alltranstech here, we do have a couple of NDT labs that we have where we can actually do the procedure qualification for you. Now that would be as long as you don't have specific equipment spelled out, where we don't have that. Now if you call out a specific model magnetic particle yoke or specific type of penetrant or whatever, and we don't have that, then you would either have to send that equipment to us to do the PQR, or we'd have to wait till travel restrictions are lifted and we can get there and do the PQR. Or one other possible thing is just kind of living with your procedure and don't change it until you can have somebody do a PQR. That's not always possible, but that's one alternate way to do it. Another thing with NDT is also all special process subcontractors, spelled out in the Appendix B, spells out the B1 form requirements. And a B1 form is required for, certain contractors, NDT contractors, and what we're talking about right now. And you need to update it, annually. Or you may have a new NDT subcontractor that you hired to come in to do some tests for you, and you would have to have an updated or a new B1 form on them. Now in here, I kind of put this right out of the B1 form. It says the facility must evaluate each subcontractor in accordance with M1003, Chapter 2, Paragraph 2.9, and document the verification method and the results of each subcontractor assessment, including objective evidence. So with NDT, like an NDT level 3, most of the objective evidence is just going to be our certification. So we could send that to you via email, scan them in and send them to you. Now with some subcontractors like special process subcontractors like plating, heat treating, really you should be going to their facility and auditing them and seeing how that, or calibration is another one. Calibration subcontractors, how are they really calibrating your equipment? You'd be surprised. The best thing to do is get there and watch how they're calibrating your equipment to make sure they're following your processes and not doing something in the back of a van down by the river. So possible answers is one solution would be, have your subcontractor send you all the permit documentations and audit that information as best you can. You should follow up with physical audit when the travel permits. So if you did have a subcontractor like calibration and they sent a calibration subcontractor and they sent you a lot of information, you may accept that, but you would say, look, I'm going to follow up when travel permits to do a physical on-site audit. Okay, that was just kind of an overview of some questions with the NDT program. Now, feel free to ask some questions or send questions, and type your questions in. Kind of ran through that thing fairly quickly, but there may be some other questions that you have. We'd be glad to answer it during this webinar. So please make sure you type your questions in, and at the end of the webinar, we will try to answer as many as we can. Now, what I'd like to do is send this over to Steve McCullough, and he's going to go through some of the welding program review and maybe some of the same problems that have happened with travel restrictions and your welding program.
Okay, I'd like to just what I want to start with, similar to what Jim did, is just kind of go through the welding program, just kind of do a little bit of review. We've done some webinars on this in the past, not sure if everybody's been through them, so we're just going to talk a little bit about welding procedures, welding certifications, and then some things we could possibly have to address during these times. So your welding procedure itself, there's two different types of welding procedures we deal with. We have a qualified welding procedure and then a pre-qualified welding procedure. You know, it all gets into what's the process that is implemented to actually make a procedure usable, welding on either a rail car, the tank, structural, jacket material. So a qualified weld procedure is, like it states, is actually qualified through welding test plates, sending them out, getting a destructive testing, and what you're trying to prove is that all the parameters and essential variables that you're using within that weld procedure meet a specific requirement, meaning tensile, ductility, all those different types of mechanical properties that we're looking for. Those are really outlined, what tests are required are outlined for the AARC3 Appendix W, and then AWS, when that's for tank, and then AWS D15 for structural. And from that information, it outlines your PQR document. Similar to NDT, you have to have a PQR document anytime you change an essential variable. So if you have a weld procedure, you could have had a weld procedure in place for 15 years, and all of a sudden you want to change an essential variable within that procedure, you have to do another PQR. And from that PQR, you basically create your welding procedure specification, which is the document that the employees use on the shop floor for welding. And we also have the option for AWS D15-1 is to do a pre-qualified weld procedure. And a pre-qualified weld procedure gets into if you go into D15-1, there's several clauses, 5, 6, 7, and 8, that really outlines special requirements you have to meet, gets into joint designs, different types of wire based on the different types of materials. And if you fall within all the criteria, you can pre-qualify it. And the great thing about a pre-qualified is you can create those without actually having to do any testing. But, one thing that's very important is, you can't just say, if an auditor comes in and says, well, you're welding on this part, where's your weld procedure? And you just can't say it's pre-qualified, I don't have to have a weld procedure. You still have to document it. You still have to have all your essential variables have to be outlined within that welding procedure. So again, the guy welding on the shop floor knows that he's within the essential variables of that pre-qualified welding procedure. Some things that you cannot pre-qualify, postal heat treat, any weld procedure that has postal heat treat, you cannot pre-qualify it. Any type of gas metal arc, which is the solid wire. If you have a short circuit transfer, very, very low amperage and volt settings, you can't pre-qualify that. Vertical down, so when you're talking about short circuit vertical down, that really gets into jacket welding. It doesn't always make sense that I can pre-qualify a structural weld where I'm welding a draft cell on, but I cannot pre-qualify vertical down welding on jackets, but that's a restriction within the standard. Stainless steel cannot be pre-qualified. There's some limitations within that for bowl liners and stuff, but in general, structural welding on stainless, I can't pre-qualify. And then aluminum materials. Again, you're going to have to basically, both for D15-1 and Appendix W, you're going to actually have to do a qualified weld procedure with a PQR. So what are some possible issues that you could be seeing, and really it all depends on your company. If you write them in-house, that's one thing. If you're using subcontractors, sometimes that can be a little more difficult. But what it really comes down to is the destructive testing, and actually also the non-destructive testing, because every time we weld a plate up, we're going to want to do some type of NDT just to make sure that the plate is good, before we start spending money doing destructive testing. So you just have to make sure if you have if you have a subcontractor that's going to do your destructive testing, very few companies have tensile machines, impact testers in-house, so you're going to have to contract that out. And then, so the question really becomes, is that company considered essential in these times? If you want to change a weld procedure, like Jim said earlier with the NDT stuff, maybe you want to live with what you're dealing with right now and try to get around, but sometimes you can't do that. So really we have to find out if the destructive testing company is available. And if they are, then, I have some customers right now that are still welding plates up, getting ready to send them out, and their destructive company is available, so you just got to verify that. Now, if it's pre-qualified, which doesn't require testing, we can, like all Transtech, we create pre-qualified welding procedures, so we can write those, from our home, send them out, have the customer review them, and then, work with them to make sure all the essential variables that they're using are met. So when we get into welder certification, there's 4 areas we really kind of focus on when it comes into welder certification. My welding process, my welding position, base metal requirements, ferrous, non-ferrous, and then electrode classification. One that I left off on here is also whether it's plate certification or pipe certification, which we talk about it in another slide. So welding process, if I'm going to certify my welder, I'm going to have to certify them per the specific processes. Now, I'm only listing the common 4 methods that are used in our industry. There's a lot more processes used out in other industries, but these are really the ones that we use in the rail car industry. We're shielded metal arc welding, which is basically stick welding. You have flux core arc welding, which is a wire process with an internal flux within the wire, gas metal arc, that's solid wire, and then submerged arc welding, which is what the picture is showing on the right-hand side, which is, again, don't do a lot of submerged arc welding in the repair shops, but it's used heavily at manufacturing. All the girth seams on a tank car are welded with submerged arc welding. And you get into the welding position, and each one of these lists different types of positions. So across the top, say AWS always tries to keep things, very, very straightforward. So F is fillet weld. So 1F is a flat fillet, 2F is horizontal, 3F is vertical, and then 4F is overhead. And then you get into the grooves. 1G is flat, 2G is horizontal, 3G is vertical, 4G is overhead. And then I get into pipe welding. Pipe welding, 1G would be a rotated pipe. 2G would be the pipe is vertical, but I'm welding horizontally around. 5G, the pipe is horizontal fixed, and I'm welding either vertical up or vertical down. And then 6G would be pipes on a 45 degree. And like I said, within these, they give you allowances. So this is right out of Appendix W, and it kind of shows you if I took a plate test, 1G, I'm really only qualified to weld, flat, which would be, 1G, and then flat for fillet. So anytime you weld the test, it's going to give you some type of other joints you can weld. So if I do a 2G, it just shows you I get flat and horizontal. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, I put a little box around that. If I take a 2G, 3G, 4G test, it basically gives me, grooves, all positions, and then fillets, all positions. And that's why we commonly give a welder a 3-position test, because if he can pass all 3 positions, then I don't really have to worry about restrictions on what he can weld and what he cannot weld. And we've always tried to, a lot of people that are involved in Appendix W are also involved in the D15-1 committee, and we try to keep everything very consistent. And as you can see this is right out of the D15-1 book. So if I take a 2G, 3G, 4G, and I know it's kind of hard to see, it's kind of small, but it gives you all positions grooves, all positions fillets. One thing that, it's still in there with the new 2019 revision, I still get all positions for fillets on pipes. So basically like socklet welds and stuff. There's some restrictions on that now with the brake pipe welding standard, but I don't really want to get into this, but this is really outlined in D15-1. So when we talked about F numbers, so F number is just basically grouping filler metals together in a classification, and as the numbers change, it's just different types. So if you look at 4, which is very commonly used in our industry, would be like, for example, a 7018 electrode. That would be an F4 filler metal. Where a 6010 or a 6011, which is right above that, is basically we use that a lot for jacket welding. That would be an F3 filler metal. And then if you jump all the way down to the the F6s, you can see like the flux cores, they really don't designate carbon steel from stainless as different F numbers. So like the ER70, T1, and I got some examples on that. I'll show you how that works out. So just as an example, like an F4 filler metal would be 7018, so then the 7018 would be the 70 with 70,000 tensile, 1 is all position, and then 8 would be a low hydrogen electrode. There's a lot of other things that are designated with the 8 about polarities and AC/DC and all that, but we really don't need to get into that. And as an example, for SMAW, again, stick welding, the same process would be E309L, which is commonly used for welding like carbon to stainless. That's an F5 filler metal. So if I qualify my welder with 7018, and then he wants a weld E309L, the stainless, since it's a different F number, he has to take a different test. So one doesn't qualify for the other. And just to kind of, and it doesn't always make sense how this is written, but so for example, in the same scenario with flux core, if I weld E71T1, which is kind of similar to the 7018, not exactly, but same tensile strength, that's an F6 filler metal. Whereas if I weld a flux core E309LT1, that's also an F6 filler metal. So if I qualify for carbon steel, I'm also qualified for stainless steel. So that's one little benefit to using flux core over SMAW or stick welding. So when you get into certification, so what are some possible concerns? So new certification, and again, if it's, a lot of companies do all their training in-house and all their testing in-house for welder certification. That's going to be business as usual, that nothing's going to change. But, as a consulting company, we have people that go out and help customers certify their welders. So we're kind of, dealing with some issues right now, because how are we going to send our people out if there's travel restrictions? So, we're trying to work on ways to possibly work with the welding candidates through electronic communication, take photographs of the, if a guy welds a plate and takes a picture of it and sends it to the weld trainer, he can say, well, this is what I think you're doing wrong. And then have training discussions, kind of go through, work on this, and again, we're just trying to get this stuff off the ground and get it started. We haven't done a whole lot of it yet, but it's just trying to do some brainstorming on how we can help our customers if they're having issues. And then the 6-month certification requirement, and this is in D15-1, and I just pulled the reference out of Appendix W. So when a welder or welding operator does not use a specific process for which he is qualified by the employer for a period exceeding 6 months, he's going to have to retest. There's not a lot of relief on that, and I really don't know how we'd get around that, and I really don't foresee the AAR or the feds giving us any relief on that. So it's process specific. So if you're certified in flux core, they just have to, you don't have to weld every process. As far as, for example, gas metal arc, you may have a welder that's certified with jacket welding, but he's also certified with aluminum welding. It's process specific. So as long as he welds with gas metal arc, he's okay. And we've always tried to, weld on a part, and, and that's kind of the whole concept is you weld on a part, it's inspected. But there is some caveats where you could just go out and weld a test plate. But the key is it needs to be inspected to make sure it's a good weld, and it needs to be documented. Because that's what when they come in an audit, they're going to look for is, hey, did the welder weld with that process in the 6 months? You're going to have some type of documentation that shows that he welded within that 6-month period. Training requirements. In Appendix W, it basically says each facility shall ensure the welders are trained and qualified in the areas of welding symbols, welding procedures, acceptance criteria, and other sections of this specification applicable to their work. So, and this was something added several years ago where we wanted to train our welders. It has a little bit more latitude than like NDT, because it's one statement in the code, so you could make your training very elaborate, or I've seen some companies where it just goes into some of the basics. But that training still needs to be done, needs to be documented. A good way to know if people are being trained is when you go out and ask your welder on the shop floor, give them a print and you say, oh, can you show me what welding symbols there are? If they can't, then they weren't trained. They need to understand that stuff. So if it's in-house training, again, not a big issue, but, we're starting to look at possibly doing some remote distance learning if we need to, try to help customers get up to speed. Just making sure the welder knows what he's looking at, what he's, there's a lot of things you can cover in that training program. The different material groups, there's a lot to the welding process. And then annual eye exams, there's basically a statement in Appendix W that basically says welders have to pass an eye exam, same as NDT Tech, Jaeger J2 chart. Again, similar to the NDT, additional designated visual acuity examiners. We talked about temporary extensions. Where temporary extensions are going to come in is if you say and again, this really doesn't define where it has to come from. It's not like the level 3 where it designates it, but most of our level 3 guide designees do the Jaeger J2. The risk you run is, say you extended it 3 months, and then the guy has an eye exam and then he has vision issues. Well, then now you're going to question everything. So you're playing that. So what might be worth it is if you can, at least give him some type of eye exam to make sure he can still pass, and then you won't have to question later on. Well, if I text him a few months later, is he going to be okay? But that's a risk you run. You run that gap of could something have gone? Could his vision gone back? Especially as you get older, it sneaks up on you. I'm gonna hand it back to Jim to just kind of go over the summary.
Okay, thanks, Steve. That was great. As a summary, again, for many NDT and welding issues, many can be solved with temporary NDT level 3 approval in your written practice or your written practice. Again, some training can be performed, by remote learning. We're still trying to develop those processes. One thing you want to look for AAR circulars that are going to be issued within the next month or so, maybe offering better direction or relief from some of these issues. Again, I know RSI is going to the AAR this week and bringing some of these questions to them, and maybe we can see some relief. And then lastly is consult your NDT level 3 and your welding administrator on a plan that can be, implemented to your program. So with that, to say, thank you for attending the webinar. And what we'd like to do right now is, I'm not sure if we have any questions or.
Yep, we have a few questions here.
Okay, great.
So here's a question. It was on the webinar last week, but it's always something that keeps coming up, and it gets into the subcontractors again. What do I do if my subcontractor certifies level 2s every 5 years, compared to the 3-year? What needs to be done to make sure they are compliant?
Well, again, that is an issue. What you may want to do is work with your subcontractor. Maybe they can start, for those people that are coming to the shop, bump them up to a 3-year interval. Maybe something you can do extra refresher training and see if they can issue out a new certification. But whatever it is, it has to be something that's on a 3-year cycle, something that's documented that you have, in case an auditor brings it up. Because again, Appendix T only allows a 3-year interval for level 1, level 3, level 2 personnel.
Okay, another one. So, if we do run into a certification issue, will the work I do now while my NDT certification is expired be acceptable later on? So they're going to if they let it expire, is it ever going to come into question the validity of their inspections?
Well, as long as they're not doing anything after the certification, once the certification expires, that's the problem. You don't want to let your NDT certifications expire. Once they expire, you can't do any work until they're, until they're recertified.
Somebody just made a comment. Remember, the 3-year cycle is based on the federal requirements for function-specific training for subpart H, which is true. That's why that's a good point.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even if even if we had Appendix T and took Appendix T and issued a new revision of Appendix T and extended the certs to a 5-year interval, the FRA would come in and say, look, we're still under hazmat training, function-specific training. We would want them to be go through retraining every 3 years. So that's why we just kind of kept that at a 3-year interval. It's the way it is going to be. You just have to make sure that your subcontractors meet those requirements. That's good. That was a good comment. That's a good question.
Yeah, and I asked a question about the extension, but I think we're still waiting on here. It basically has the ARFRA given allowances for expiring NDT certifications like there has been for other parts of the railroad or the shipping industry.
No, not that we're aware of.
Yeah, I think.
Now they did have some relief on hazmat training, and it was really mainly for people who are already hazmat certified and are due for the 3-year refresher. But for initial hazmat training, there was no relief on that. If there's either have to do the hazmat training for initial new employees within the 90 days and 60 days. Yeah. And there's not much relief on that from the feds.
Can a technician perform a test after the certification had expired and then have, for example, a Transtech recertify him later after travel opens? Perform a test after certification expires.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope there.
Yeah.
I would say let's head that off at the pass and make sure that certification doesn't expire, because you can't. It would be something like maybe on a positive recall where you say, look, we're not going to ship anything until that comes in. But that's a scary proposition. I would say the best thing you want to do is not let that certification expire. Again, there's a lot of stuff we can possibly do to keep that certification going. Just don't want it to expire, because once it does, we can recertify them. But any test they've done after it expires, they shouldn't be doing any testing after it expires.
Yeah, can the level 3 extend the certification?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's ways you can extend the certification. And again, what you want to do is make sure and I know personally, if just saying, if you say, hey Jim, you send me an email today saying, I have a certification coming due tomorrow. What can I do? We all have to kind of push the panic button. What you want to do is give us all a heads up ahead of time, 2 or 3 weeks before it even expires. And maybe we can set up refresher training online, do something. Just give us a little buffer there, 2, 3, 4 week notification.
Should there be an end date on the level 3 certification extension?
Yeah, that's a very good question. What I know I do for one customer, we can say, look, we're going to extend your certification. Say it's coming due April 1st. We're going to say, look, we're going to extend it to May 1st. We do put it's not extended on an infinite amount of time. We do give it a deadline and say, look, and by May 1st, May 15th, whatever, maybe give it 6 weeks, and we say, look, we will then come back in and do the refresher. This happens even when the travel restrictions are not here. We have a look. You just can't get to every shop on a timely manner. So you may say, look, we're going to extend the cert for 30 days, and then after 30 days, I know I'm planning to get to that facility, before May 1st, whatever the date is, and then that's when we'll do the training. You never want to get an open-ended cert. That's a good point.
All right, that's all I have for the questions.
All right, well, if that's all the questions.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks.
Hopefully everybody enjoyed the webinar. Look for our upcoming webinar next week on critical quality issues. Chris Fennell will be sending out that very soon, the link to sign in for that. We just want to keep these webinars going to keep our customers informed and with current situations and help all we can in these kind of crazy times.
Again, thank you, Jim and Steve, and thank you everyone for joining. And please join our webinar next week. Like Jim said, the webinar registration will follow shortly. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.